Rebecca from History, Myths and Legends, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the acts that were in place around the time of Matthew Hopkins, prior and since. So this is part of our project where we're looking at Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General and the witchcraft trials, but we're also looking at witchcraft generally outside of those periods too. So it's important, first of all, to understand that people have been accused of being witches for hundreds of years prior to the act coming into place. So it is generally thought that when Christianity started to take over paganism as the main religion in the country, that people started to become suspicious of the old ways and the people that still practice a lot of the old ways. And a lot of these were accused of being witches. And as we go through time, James I is very famous for a witchcraft act, but actually the first act came into place under Henry VIII. Now I'm going to read from a document to make sure I give you the correct information because it's quite complex. And the document comes from a website called Parliament UK. It's a really good website for looking at current and old acts because they're all published on there. So I'm going to read out what the first act was called. It was passed by Henry VIII in 1541, and it was called an Act Against Conjurations, Witchcraft, Sorcery and Enchantments. In this act, magical practices which were seen as disruptive or harmful to the realm or the people of the realm was outlawed. And if the magic did cause harm and you were found guilty, then you would be sentenced to death. That was the punishment. And the crime was dealt with by the church court at the time. Now we know that Henry VIII did actually practice in a lot of things that could be deemed as witchcraft later on in the years. He was an alchemist. He used to make lots of different concoctions out of lots of different things to help keep him healthy. He was extremely paranoid about being sick. And when his son, King Edward IV, was born, he also was extremely worried about his son being sick, and he practiced lots of things that in the future could probably be deemed as witchcraft. But for the purposes of his realm, he was very concerned about people doing things that could harm others, and therefore it would be treason and or heresy, and then you would be sentenced to death. So this act continued until 1547, when Henry's son, King Edward IV, took over the crown, and he repealed the act in all ways. There's no sign of any act around this until King Henry's other daughter, Elizabeth I, came into reign, and she introduced an act in 1562. And just bear in mind that after King Edward IV was Mary I, and she did not do anything to do with witchcraft. She was very much focused on returning her country to a Catholic country. So I think witchcraft kind of took a sideline. There was no acts in place around witchcraft during Edward IV and Mary I's reign. So we then look at Elizabeth I, who is King Henry's other daughter. And in 1562, she put in place the Acts Against Conjurations, Enchantments and Witchcraft. So the wording has changed slightly. And the trials moved away from the church court. So previously under Henry VIII, you would be looked at under the church court, and you were found whether you were guilty or not through them. But now it was the normal court, it was the ordinary court that every crime went through. The act also changed. So previously under Henry VIII, there was only one outcome. You would be sentenced to death. Whereas now it would actually distinguish between minor and major. So if you did something that came under the act that meant you were found guilty, you would either be found as a minor offence, and you would have a year's imprisonment and a quarterly public humiliation on the market square. Or if you did it twice and you didn't learn your lesson, or you had done a major incident under the act, you were sentenced to death. This went on for quite a while, and then when Queen Elizabeth I died, James I then took over. And James I was previously the King of Scotland, and he had experienced some very bad things with witches. He had seen things that made him extremely paranoid. He was terrified of witches. So he then changed the act, and this is the act that is more famous. 1603, the Act Against Conjuration, Witchcraft and Dealing with Evil and Wicked Spirits was introduced. So that took over Elizabeth I's act. Now, this changed because it clearly defined the relationship between witchcraft and the devil. So it connected being witchcraft was evil. And previously, you had to do something to make you be accused of being a witch, whereas now you just had to be a witch. You know, if anyone said that's a witch, then you could be arrested and you would go through trials and examinations, etc. And it's this act that the Witchfinder General and many others like him, Matthew Hopkins, actually did his trials under. This is the act he used to justify what he did. So it's a really important act. And hundreds of women and men across the country were tortured, and majority were hung as a result of this act. Now, this act stayed in place until 1735. And in 1735, the Witchcraft Act was put in place, which repealed all the previous acts. And this Witchcraft Act had two major changes. It had a much broader definition of bad magic, and it also looked at fraudulent practices. So things like fortune tellers or people like that could now be accused under this act. And this stayed in place for a very, very long time. And actually the last person to be put in prison under this act was actually in 1944. And as part of that imprisonment, there was a huge campaign to say that actually this act needs to be repealed because it's not fit for purpose any longer. So in 1951, the Witchcraft Act was finally repealed, and it was replaced by the Fraudulent Mediums Act, which addresses issues of deception and fraud by people, so that people are protected from that. So as you can see, over the passage of times, it's moved completely away from witchcraft now looks at fraud. So it's a really interesting piece of information, and I will go back to the beginning and summarise for you. So prior to 1541, anyone accused of a witch was just dealt with locally by people within the local community. In 1541, Henry VIII introduced the first act, an act against conjurations, witchcraft, sorcery and enchantments, and this was dealt with by the church court. His son, King Edward IV, in 1547, repealed the act completely. And there will be no further legislation until 1562 in Elizabeth I's era. Then it was changed in 1603 by James I, and that's the act that people use for the Witchfinder trials. And then in 1735, it was then changed to the Witchcraft Act, the last person being convicted in 1944. And finally, the Witchcraft Act was appealed in 1951 and replaced by the Fraudulent Mediums Act. So a very interesting piece of our history, and I hope it helps with doing research around what legislation people are using to convict witches. So just to confirm, this is under the Parliament UK. There is a very long and interesting document on there that you can read through, and hopefully make a little bit more sense than what I've just garbled out. And I hope this helps with your research and you found this helpful. Have a lovely day. Thank you. Goodbye.